Hello, I'm the Grub Street Lodger.
Oh, that's it. Oh.
Today I wish to talk about a BBC adaptation. Now the BBC have an impressive track record in gathering some of the greatest actors together and putting on some of the most lavish period dramas that have ever been seen. Such as these.
Now we come to John Dice and John Dice.
Please, sir, I want some more.
Call me Miss Havisham. Perhaps you were meant for something special.
But they haven't often dabbled in the 18th century, and I can see why. People like Dickens have a certain visual sensibility that translates far better onto screen than some of the 18th century writers. However, today we're going to look at the BBC's most recent 18th century novel adaptation. Look, will you just cut it out? We'll get there, alright? Today we are talking about Fanny Hill, a 2007 adaptation of John Cleland's 1748 novel Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure. First penned in the Fleet Prison by John Cleland, this book essentially got him out of debtor's jail. He got 20 guineas for it. He sold it to the publishers called Ralph and Griffiths. They made £10,000 on it. It was a good seller. A year later, in 1749, they were arrested for corrupting the king's subjects and the book was banned. But it didn't go away. It carried on being bought on the black market until 1970, when it could be officially published again, which was 10 years after the Chatterley trial. Now this version was written by Andrew Davies, and the BBC frequently go to him for their period dramas. He wrote their Vanity Fair, he wrote their Pride and Prejudice. Yes, that Pride and Prejudice. And he also wrote their recent War and Peace adaptation. And in 2007 he tried Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure, otherwise known as Fanny Hill. This was made for BBC4, which is sort of the BBC's highbrow channel. And it was in fact the most viewed programme on BBC4 for years until they started bringing along those Swedish, Scandinavian, whatever cop shows that people like. I thought I'd review it because if it did well for BBC4, maybe it might up my ratings a little bit. This is a strange book to choose to adapt. I mean, yes, there's the sex, but we all know sex sells. It's more the fact that this is a porn novel, and it has a porn plot. One or more people are together in a room, they end up humping. I mean, there's not a lot more to it than that. I mean, I don't think there's a story. However, the writer said,
I remembered it as a succession of erotic scenes. I didn't think it had much of a story, but then reading it again, I was really pleased to discover you could make a really good drama out of it.
Let's see how he tells it then. So, Fanny Hill is an innocent from Lancashire who's just lost her parents. She is enticed by a friend to come down to London where she meets the kindly Ma Brown, who immediately gives her work. Hang on, Fanny Hill is Mole Hackabout. You know, Mole Hackabout. Young country lass, met off the coach by a board. She shacks up with a rich city man but is rude and intemperate, so he throws her out where she becomes a common prostitute and bedfellow of a highwayman before being thrown in Bridewell prison where she's leered at and has to beat hemp. Freed from prison, she lies dying while doctors argue and her little boy sits too close to the fire, and when she's dead her mourners are only interested in what they can rob from her room. You know, Mole Hackabout from the Harlot's Progress. Hogarth made these in 1737, and these prints and these pictures, well, they made his fame. Cleland would certainly have seen a copy or few of the Harlot's Progress. They probably influenced him in some way. They also provided the inspiration for A Harlot's Progress, a much better period docudrama with a really good cast made by Channel, not BBC, 4 in 2005. The year before this Fanny Hill came out. That must be why this film has no visual nods in it to Hogarth. Oh well. Back to Fanny. She goes to Mrs. Brown's where she's shacked up with roommate Phoebe and they... Oh. That's not in the book, is it? Yes. Yes, it is. Fanny Hill's entry into this world starts off with a little bit of light lesbian fingering. Oh well, good start gently. As she spends her time in the brothel, she slowly loses more and more of her innocence, peeking at the madam and seeing her first penis.
It's so big.
She is introduced to Cousin Croft, a lecherous old man who wants to take her virginity. But not realising the game she's in, she struggles and leaves him...
Are you dead, sir?
No, I'm not dead. I might as well be. This is all you're doing, you coquettish little cock teaser, pressing your thighs together so that a man can't help but go off at half-cock.
Too bad, Croft. Eventually, she comes to the realisation that she had little option but to be bartered off to the highest bidder, and if she's lucky, she might end up doing very well out of it. But as she comes to the realisation, she meets Charles. He gives her the most immortal chat-up line.
Are you an angel, Fanny?
Yes.
Are you an angel?
This line is not from the book. Very little of what the characters say is in the book. Mostly, the book just reports dialogue, and it focuses mainly on what Fanny is feeling at the time and how these affect the emotions in her breast. Mostly the emotions of pleasure. It is memoirs of a woman of pleasure, after all. The two agree to run away together, pretending to be a married couple and shacking up in a few rooms owned by the dour Mrs. Jones. There, Fanny has her first time with a man. It is short, it is painful, and it is awkward. But as the narrating Fanny asks the audience...
And what was your first time like? A paradise of sensual delight? No, I didn't think so.
Again, not in the book. In this adaptation, the narrating Fanny often comes back to ask questions to the audience. I think this is to legitimise the sex a little more by grounding it in common human experience. The book doesn't bother so much with that as with the virtuoso and flowery descriptions of mechanics. This is part of the same scene in the book. Alas, it was enough I knew his pleasure to submit joyfully to him, whatever pain I foresaw it would cost me. He now resumes his attempts once more. First he put one of the pillows under me to give the blank of his aim a more favourable elevation, and another under my head in ease of it. Then, spreading my thighs and placing himself between them, made them rest upon his hips, applying then the point of his machine to the slit into which he sought entrance. It was so small he could scarce assure himself of it being rightly pointed. He looks, he feels, and satisfies himself, then driving forward with his fury, his prodigious stiffness, thus impacted, wedge-like, breaks the union of those parts and gained him just the insertion of the tip of it, lip-deep, which being sensible of, he improved his advantage, and following well his stroke in a straight line, forcibly deepens his penetration, but put me in such an intolerable pain from the separation of the sides of that soft passage by a hard thick body, I could have screamed out, but I was unwilling to alarm the house. I held my breath, and crammed my petticoat, which was turned up over my face, into my mouth, and bit it through in agony. And then, it gets better for her. She gets pleasure, yeah. But, that was quite a tame part of the book, really. As you can see, it's less about what they're saying and more about what goes where and how. We then go into a soft, focused montage of 3 days of bliss.
When love is a seedling, tender and small, without warmth and nutrition, it won't grow at all. So we hit the hothouse, holed up and hidden in a room where the telephone's ringing will not reach us. We hot-blooded, hungry, pre-biblical creatures make our Eden where the fruit is not forbidden.
As you can see, the film has a habit of transitioning through sort of blurry dissolving effects. And it often has sort of lens flares or candle flares or bits of the sun. It gives it all a kind of dreamlike, soporific quality, as if it's being remembered through some sort of druggy haze. Anyway, back to the story. Charles is a young layabout completely dependent on his father for his wealth, so he takes Fanny to meet him and get his blessing. So they go together and... it's Cousin Croft from earlier. You know, Cousin Croft.
I didn't lay out 50 guineas to spend in me breeches.
The man who failed to have her in the beginning. Well, he's not happy about Charles's choice and he frightens him away. They go back to the house and Fanny tells him she is pregnant. He is then called away to his father and doesn't return. When Fanny goes to inquire, Charles's father tells her that Charles has been kidnapped and sent away to the plantations in the East Indies. She swoons and faints, and when it comes to it, it is revealed that...
You did lose the baby, of course. But on the whole, I'd say that was a blessing in disguise in the circumstances.
Wow. That Miss Jones is really callous. Well, she wants her money. And she wants it off Fanny, and Fanny has to earn it, so she arranges for Fanny to get together with Mr. H, who is in need of a mistress. We actually met Mr. H earlier on in the brothel. And that's the end of part 1. What's interesting about part 1 is this is a 200-page book. And part 1 finishes around about page 50. Now I think this is a move from the filmmaker to focus on, as he put it, the story. Because, well, this is the bit where most of the story is. This is the bit where we meet Fanny, where she falls into her new life, where she meets her love, and where she's torn apart from her love. This bit, that's just kind of sex until she gets back with Charles again. So, part 2, the bit with more sex in it. Shall we get on? Right. So, Fanny recaps what's been going on so far. And we get a few scenes with her and Mr. H. Their relationship's very different. She says she's not going to ever love him, but she likes being with him. He teaches her an awful lot. Yes, about that. But he also teaches her how to appreciate poetry, and how to talk nice, and how to be a bit of a lady. And they get on pretty well considering. Mr. H is actually my favourite character in the book, because he's a little bit different. He's obviously looking for something that he hasn't found, and he finds it in Fanny for a little while, but then things start to get a bit silly. Having caught Mr. H with his maid, she decides to get her own back by making a pawn of her footman William. They get caught in the act, and as William says...
I don't know what came over me. It was like there was this wild beast inside me. In 1 minute, I was chafing her leg like she asked me to, and the next, and I don't know how it was. I was on her, and I was in her, and I was up her.
In the book, this was a sustained tryst. William, although not being very bright, is...
I saw, with wonder and surprise, not the plaything of a boy, nor the weapon of a man, but a positive maypole that would have done credit to a young giant. Such a breadth of animated ivory. In short, it stood an object of terror and delight. And with no little trepidation, I guided the furious battering ram into my... Oh, it is so hard to find a dainty way of putting it, and I never cared for coarse language. I guided it into my palpitating and pleasure-thirsty channel.
And that is pretty much the only sustained bit of Cleland we have in the whole film. As you can see, it is most ingenious when it comes to naming large penises. Indeed, in an age that gave us Suki Tawdry, Ebenezer Pentweasel and Lord Whimsy Banter, he plays his names rather straight.
Be gentle with my little Fanny, sir.
Yes, even the name Fanny, which at this time had only innocent connotations. The other connotations came after the book. Unlike Mole Hackabout, whose first name Mole was slang term for prostitute, and surname Hackabout references the hackney carriage, which could be hired anywhere, rather like the Hackney Woman, or indeed the Hackney Writer. Let's move on. She's kicked out, and having nowhere to go, finds the friend who enticed her to London in the first place, who works at a milliner's. In the 18th century, milliners were often known to be fronts for bawdy houses, and this is no different. Is everyone in this book either a prostitute or a madam? This new brothel is a rather higher class affair than the last one and caters to a greater range of people and tastes. The fact that it is hidden behind a milliner's is apparently one of those things that everyone in the 18th century knew. Mrs. Cole has a prospective job for Fanny.
How should you like to be a virgin again, Fanny?
She accepts and is engaged to break in a young nobleman. This was another common ruse that everyone knew in the 18th century, and in the book Fanny resells her virginity several times, but it only occurs once in this film, with the dad watching his son through a peephole and giving encouragement.
Come on, my son!
Fanny settles down in the brothel and enjoys the sensation of family and of belonging. She also picks up a stray impotent man who becomes the brothel pet until she sexes him to death. Unfortunately, the brothel is raided and Fanny escapes, becoming destitute until she reaches her lowest point and is raped in an alleyway by a sailor. Now let me say, this doesn't happen in the book. In the book, Fanny's lowest point is when she loses Charles, but that doesn't fit the traditional sort of three-act structure that we want in our films, and so they've introduced this rape scene. In fact, the book goes slightly different from the film at this point. In the book, she meets another client who likes to get whipped, and then another one who likes to stroke her hair and smell her gloves. And then she takes on the impotent man as a lover, but he bores her, so she chooses to go out to a pub and get buggered by various sailors. Then there's a threesome, then there's some lesbian stuff, then they have some sex outside, and then she goes to a molly house, which is a kind of gay nightclub. She has a bisexual experience and sees two men having sex.
First then, moistening well with spittle his instrument, he pointed, he introduced it, as I could plainly discern, not only from its direction and my losing sight of it, but by the writhing, twisting, and soft-murmured complaints of the young sufferer.
Thanks, Princess Seraphina, for reading that for me. Indeed, all of these experiences are pleasurable. The book is Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure. The film and book coalesce when Fanny meets a sober old man and becomes his maid. In the book, this is because Mrs. Cole has retired and Fanny's down on her luck. In the film, it's because of the raid. He treats her nicely and politely dies, leaving her all his money. One day, a rich lady in her carriage, a highwayman hunts it down. Except it's not a highwayman, it is...
Charles!
And the two get married and live happily ever after. So, why should anyone read Fanny Hill? Indeed, why should they watch it?
Rosy-tipped puppies.
Well, apart from those, are there any other reasons?
I think Fanny Hill will appeal to an audience today. I think above all because it's got such a strong central female character.
No, she doesn't. Compared to Tom Jones, Tom Jones goes on a similarly episodic adventure, but in each episode he learns a little bit more about wisdom. Fanny Hill learns nothing. Indeed, for the book to work, Fanny Hill has to not learn anything. She has to not reflect on her experiences. Because the people reading the book want a kind of raunchy, sexy good time. And for Fanny Hill to be able to think about that would ruin it for everyone. So, yeah, she gets by on her, well, not her innocence so much, just her simplicity, or indeed her stupidity. It's a bit like Forrest Gump in that respect. The unreflective nature of Fanny Hill is what saves her and the book from overtones of degradation.
And the wonderful thing about the story is the way that the character of Fanny turns all their vices to her advantage.
But she doesn't. The only time that she actually uses sex as a weapon against other people is when she seduces William, and that puts her in a far worse place than she was before. The fact is, people read the novel to be aroused, and they read it now because there's something goofily quaint in writing that aroused their forebears. Ultimately, what does Fanny Hill teach us? It teaches us that even 250 years ago, people had sex for pleasure, and that they pursued that pleasure in the same variety and creativity as people nowadays, and that the pursuit of sex for pleasure had its winners and its losers. As a work of art, it also teaches us that if you take the sex out of life and present it by itself, it comes across as faintly ridiculous. Hence the changes that the filmmakers had to make to turn it into a story. Is Fanny Hill worth reading? Yeah, if you want a good laugh and you want to shock your friends. Is it worth seeing? I enjoyed this adaptation. It's a rather easy, silly watch, and it whiles away a few hours. Rather like the book. That's all I've got to say about that, really. Next time, we're going to look at how you take a biting, vicious satire and turn it into a children's film. Till then, thank you.
Take it easy. Let's talk about sex.